3 years ago today, on August the 30th, 2021, the final American soldier boarded an aircraft at Kabul International Airport and left in what was the final departure for the U.S. Armed Forces after 20 years of disastrous war. 82nd Airborne Commander Major General Chris Donahue was the last soldier to leave the tarmac at Kabul and closed out one of the worst histories of the U.S. military in recent times. And this was such a terrible situation because it was entirely avoidable. There was so many people that were talking at the time about how did this happen and who was responsible, and everybody wanted to blame somebody else. It was David Petraeus' fault. It was Barack Obama's fault. Donald Trump, Joe Biden. Biden took a lot of heat for it and all this. But listen, the problem really was it was America's fault, and it was all of our leaders across the board. And you can go all the way back to George Bush and everybody in between. And this was one of the worst disasters because it was entirely predictable. It was entirely foreseeable. It was not something that surprised people. It was not a disaster that shouldn't have happened. It was not a case to where defeat was taken from the jaws of victory. We had it in our hand, and only if the politicians hadn't stolen it, man, we would have had a victory. No, it was never like that. And I'm going to have somebody come on today that it can talk firsthand just about how serious this was and how knowable this disaster was. And that is Matt Ho, a good friend of mine, friend of the shows. He's on here quite a bit of the time. And just so a lot of you know, we have a lot of history going back, he and I, all the way back to 2009, specifically on this case. And in 2009, actually, Matt, I don't know if you could talk a little bit about it. You made a lot of notoriety. In fact, the way that I even discovered that you exist is because you resigned from the State Department after a very promising start to a career because of the Afghan policy by the, not the Biden administration, the Obama administration. I wonder if you could tell us first a little bit about why you did that on that in 2009.
All right. Thanks, Danny. Thanks for having me on and talk about this. Of course, this is a war that we seem to have forgotten. The only reason I feel it's even been spoken about this week is because of the political campaign going on, and the commentary is completely empty commentary regarding that war. But anyway, I had been in the Marine Corps. I was in the Iraq War twice. I went over to the State Department, got appointed into the Foreign Service, and went to Afghanistan in April of 2009 as a political officer. I served first in the East, and I moved down to the South into Zabul province, where I was in charge of a provincial reconstruction team alongside an Air Force lieutenant colonel. And what I saw in Afghanistan was that it was no different than the war in Iraq. And I saw that the Obama administration was no different than the Bush administration, that the necessity to escalate the war in Afghanistan was being done almost entirely for domestic political purposes, that the Democrats wanted to prove that they were better war fighters than the Republicans were, and that this was the good war and we're the ones who are going to win it. I saw that any type of escalation of the war would not just be futile, but dangerous, that sending more foreign forces into what was essentially an ongoing war, an ongoing civil war, a civil war that we long had a hand in, but that continuing to put foreign soldiers into that civil war, present this occupying force, was only going to give legitimacy and greater public support to the Afghan Taliban. Essentially, what we were going to do by escalating that war in 2009 was to confirm the Afghan Taliban as the National Liberation Army that they said they were. And that's essentially what happened over the years. I also saw, too, that the Afghan government was incredibly corrupt. It was incredibly predatory. It was a government composed of warlords and drug lords. And after taking part twice in the war in Iraq, I was morally and intellectually broken. And after 5 months in Afghanistan, seeing what I was seeing, understanding what was going to come from this escalation of the war, I resigned in protest.
Now, I remember in our conversations at the time, because I tracked you down from that article and a lot of the news that was going on there. And I remember We got together at one of the restaurants near one of the metro stops. I can't remember which one it was right off.
In Roslyn.
Roslyn, that's right. It was at the Roslyn station. We met there many times over the years, it turns out. But I remember one of the first things you told me was that, from your observation, was that the more troops we send in, then the more violence there was, and then the more troops we sent in, and it started this escalating cascade of bad developments that we really saw all the way through to the very end of the war. It almost never changed, especially during the Obama surge when he sent, the 140,000 U.S. and NATO troops over there. That just, everything played out the way you showed it to me, and I know you've said this many times. You take no comfort in being right, but man, you were right all along. And that's one of the things I want to highlight here. Not even you and I personally, but the fact that these fundamentals were known all along, that we're not going to have a successful outcome.
Right. Absolutely, Danny. I mean, so when I resign, I get frustrated. I call the Washington Post after I've been home for a few weeks, and I say, I'm essentially, I want to write an op-ed, because what I'm seeing, if people remember back in 2009, the fall of 2009, this question of what to do about Afghanistan, to whether to surge or not to surge in Afghanistan, dominated the American news for months, for really from July, I would say, through December. This was the major news story of the time. And when I was seeing in the national debate, it was devoid of anything that I knew the reality to be there. The reality of the war, the reality of the Taliban, the reality of us as an occupying power. But as you said, it wasn't just me. I mean, all the information was there. At about the same time that I resigned, the Boston Globe publishes a leaked report from our intelligence community that states 9 out of 10 Taliban members are not fighting out of some type of religious zeal or ideological commitment, but they're fighting in resistance to occupation. Right. I mean, there's another poll at the same time that came out that said 80% of Afghan men do not view the U.S. presence as good for their country. I mean, like, all the indicators are there in the public domain to say this doesn't add up to what General McChrystal and General Petraeus and Secretary Clinton are telling President Obama about what to do in the Afghan war. I mean, so the other part of it as well was that when I resigned, and rather than writing an op-ed, the Washington Post writes this huge story on me, dating myself by referencing a printed copy. But back when we used to call a big story front page and above the fold.
Above the fold, yeah.
Right. And that was me. There's my face on the Post, and huge story. I get in a cab that morning. The cab driver recognizes me. It was very surreal. But anyway, Karen DeYoung wrote the article on me, and it was 3,000 word, profile and courage. I think I might have said it to you a couple of weeks ago, like it was as if like an addition to Jack Kennedy's book. It was kind of ridiculous. But when I asked Karen, I said, why did you write this big story on me like this? Why did you expend so much capital on me? Karen said, because, when I asked about what we were saying in your resignation letter, why this escalation won't work, why we need to get out of the war, etc. When I asked people at the State Department, at the CIA, at the National Security Council, at the Pentagon about this, she said, everyone agreed with you. And that's what I found throughout that time, was when I resigned and my letter went through the embassy and then went back to Washington, D.C. It was people were in agreement with me. My counterparts who were in similar provinces in Afghanistan, so very violent provinces, they were wholeheartedly agree with me. The embassy staff was in agreement with me. Carl Eichenberry, who was the ambassador to Afghanistan at the time, who had been formerly a 3-star general in command of the war in Afghanistan, he told me, if you stay here and keep working with me, I will write a foreword for your resignation letter. That's how much I believe in what you're saying, but we need people who are going to think like you're thinking and say what you're saying here. Same thing. I came home. I had to go see Richard Holbrooke, who at that point was a special representative for Afghanistan, Pakistan, direct line to the president. And, I had to go see him. I had to go up to the Waldorf, and I go up to the Waldorf in New York. It was during the UN General Assembly. I go into his suite at the Waldorf. Who's standing there? It's Sherrod Coper-Coles, who was Holbrooke's British counterpart. Coper-Coles had years of experience in Afghanistan. Coper-Coles said, "Oh, you're the guy who wrote that letter. I completely agree with you." And then I went and saw Holbrooke, and Holbrooke said, "I agree with 95% of what you wrote. The other 5% really doesn't matter." So like there was this consensus that this war was unwinnable, that this was a fool's errand. As the great Scott Horton wrote his book, entitled it that way, Fool's Errand. And it was. And it just was maddening and infuriating that this was clear to anyone who took more than a few minutes to get past the propaganda, that this thing was unwinnable and futile and was dangerous in the way it would explode. It could potentially explode the support for the Taliban in Afghanistan, and it certainly did. So, I mean, it was looking back, and then of course 5 years ago in 2019. We had the Pentagon papers. The Afghan papers get published by the Washington Post, which just showed the clear evidence of the United States government effort to lie about the war in Afghanistan. It's essentially what happened, just year upon year, official after official, general after general, lying about the war in Afghanistan, saying how the war in Afghanistan was making progress, just some more time, we just need to persevere, and, things, we've turned a corner, all the same phrases. I'd be remiss if I didn't also make a point about you as well, Danny, in the sense that you resign, or no, you didn't resign, you go to Congress in January 2012 after spending a year in Afghanistan. And your role in Afghanistan was one where you went around the country. You had a really interesting billet there where you talked to everyone from the grunts out on patrols. You go out with them, and then you be in the battalion, the brigade, the division level headquarters. You'd be back at ISAF headquarters. You had a view of the Afghan war, which very few people ever had in the way that you did, in terms of the prevalence of what you saw. And you were there for a year, and you came home, and you realized it was as bad as you believed it was going to be. And then you went and you took from your position at the joint on the joint staff. You compiled a classified report, and you went to Congress, and you said to the Congress, the generals are lying to you about what's happening in Afghanistan. This is what's happening. And 5 members of Congress read your report. The New York Times wrote a front page story about you doing this. How many times after that did the New York Times ever call you? And everything you said in that report was true. Everything you said in that report came to pass. Everything that we've now seen, either because of the work of journalists or because we can read these Afghan papers, we know that what you did, Danny, in 2012 was to try and sound the alarm and tell Congress the generals are lying about you. This Afghan war, we are continuing to lose it. We're not making progress, and nothing was done. And I also want to say, for people, when I resigned, I was 36-year-old single guy, plenty of money in the bank. No big deal for me to quit and move on. Danny, you weren't even at full retirement yet, and you had 2 kids. So you really did jeopardize your career by doing this. And so, what you did, in 2012, an absolute hero. And I know what motivated you. One, you didn't want to see this war continue. You didn't want to see your country fail. But I know what really motivated was the fact that you would go out on these patrols with these kids in Afghanistan, and then they get their legs blown off. They get their balls blown off. They die. And what was it for? And meanwhile, their generals are lying about what's going on there. And
that actually is what got me. That when men that I had met were subsequently killed, I say men, they were kids. It was a couple of specialists, and for no good reason. Then I saw that the generals lied about what had happened and made it out to this be some heroic battle that really helped the war and all this stuff. And I said, that's complete nonsense. There was no truth to it. He knew there was no truth to it. And that's kind of what undergirded our entire war here. And Matt, we see so many times that is the same mentality that has just perpetuated the upper echelons and continues to this day, whether you're talking about what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine war with our activities there. It's now just become inculcated in the culture that the senior leaders will say whatever they want, whatever they think they need to in order to get the outcome they prefer, irrespective of whether it's accurate or not. And they know it's not in many cases. And I think that's one of the enduring legacies of the disaster of the physical battlefield that we saw, that it's now perpetuated this poison that's stayed in our upper echelons to this day, potentially causing us more trouble. Now,
absolutely, Dan. I mean, you can't, just to emphasize that point, there's two aspects to this. One, the fact that there has been no accountability for this war. That speaks to issues of justice, integrity, who we are, this idea of a higher immorality, which we talked about the other day, a higher immorality among our elites, that they're allowed to get away with this by the public. The other side of it, though, is it makes certain that it happens again. If there was no consequences for this war, if there was no consequences for the Iraq war, no consequences for the torture, no consequences for the unconstitutional surveillance, spying on the American people, no consequences for supporting the genocide in Gaza, it makes it certain that it happens again. It makes it inevitable.
And that's one of the reasons why we have this channel. One of the reasons why we have you on so often, because we're going to keep telling the truth. We're going to keep putting it out there. And the more we get folks who are watching our channel and subscribe to it and share it with other people, more and more people get the truth, so that over time that they're not going to be able to hide anymore. And I'm going to show a couple of examples here. One interesting thing, actually, I want to get you to do before that. For folks who may be aware, so you and I met in 2009, and by 2010, just a year later, just before I deployed, you and I wrote a joint piece in the Defense News, which really exposed a lot of the things in. This is where we started going public with what we were talking about, that's saying, hey, there's some real problem here, and it's missing the big picture. One of the things, Matt, from this article that I particularly found interesting, and I think really stood the test of time, was the last article there, which I hope doesn't fully come to pass, where it says, relying on 20th century geographic centric strategies that bludgeon tiny pieces of the earth terrain with large numbers of conventional combat forces to battle 21st century enemies who operate in geographically dispersed networks may lead to a future 9/11 that otherwise might have been prevented. And what we were saying there, we've continued to just beat that drum, is that by focusing on this claim that you have to have troops everywhere, and that somehow we're safe, from 9/11, creating more 9/11s by having troops on the ground, is ridiculous. And in fact, it accelerates the possibility, because of what you identified earlier on in this war as continuing to happen to this day in the Middle East, where we have troops in Iraq and in Syria and all these other kind of places like Gary's showing on the map right there, is that when you keep being this occupation troop or so, you keep building enemies and you give them access to you and ability to fight, etc., as opposed to withdrawing. And just let me ask you, Matt, so many people said for so long, we can't withdraw from Afghanistan because then it'll just be handing a victory to the terrorists, and all of it, we'll risk a new 9/11. Okay, it's been 3 years. There haven't been any new 9/11s. So, and it's funny because I see people saying, oh, well, it's just a matter of time, it's going to happen. But can you explain and why you wanted to put that last paragraph in there, and what that means to, a 20th century mentality versus a 21st century enemy that's geographically dispersed?
It was the realization that the trope that we all get taught, that we're always fighting the last war when this war is different, was entirely true. And in my resignation letter, I said, look, if you're going to hold to this idea that we have to garrison Afghanistan to prevent another 9/11, well, then we need to go and we need to garrison Pakistan. We need to garrison Malaysia. We need to garrison Qatar. We need to garrison Germany, because that's where the bulk of the planning took place for the 9/11 attacks. This idea that the biggest safe havens for the 9/11 attackers was not Afghanistan. It was in Germany. It was in the United States. We had 9/11 hijackers in the United States 18 months before the attacks took place. The biggest training centers for them were the flight academies and the martial arts facilities they attended while they were in the United States. I mean, so this whole idea of a safe haven, even a safe haven, is just an absolute myth. It was just something that was an old idea, an old conception that fitted what was needed now as an excuse to maintain this war. And you'd hear our leaders at the time talk about it in a way as if, I remember General Petraeus speaking about the need to clear Kandahar. that as if we didn't clear Kandahar, do you remember in 2010, that was going to be a big operation. We were going to go into Kandahar and clear it. And thank God they never did that operation. But we have to do this, McChrystal and Petraeus were saying, because remember 9/11, as if the planes that took off and hit the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center came from Kandahar. It's just so devoid of any type of critical thought, right? Examination. And it was just, but this gets back to what all nations do throughout history when they go to war and they want to propel the war and keep support among their populations is they moralize and they scaremonger, right? So in particular, the scaremonger, if we pull out of Afghanistan, then we're going to have another 9/11. And that was certainly what you'd hear all throughout our occupation, all throughout Barack Obama's presidency. That's what he was getting hammered with, when Barack Obama, and I recommend people read Obama's Wars by Bob Woodward. Really excellent detailing of the debate that went into Obama's second part, his secondary escalation of the war. Because you have to remember, by the time the fall of 2009 comes around, Barack Obama has sent almost 40,000 American troops to Afghanistan. And this is actually something I want to point out, because I think people have lost sight of how big this war was. When Barack Obama comes into office, we have about 30,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, about equivalent number of contractors, and about 15 or 20,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan. Within 18 months of his being in office, there's 100,000 American troops in Afghanistan, 100,000 contractors, and 40,000 NATO troops. Basically, a 250,000 man army by the summer of 2010 in Afghanistan. Right. So this was massive. People forget how big this was. Our appropriations by the Congress every year were between $100 and $120 billion a year for this war. This is how big this war was. So what you see is that, like, as detailed in Obama's wars, is that the president is really put into a corner. And politically, most importantly, he's got, and this is not detailed in the book, but it's something you could hear, in other sources at the time, as well as just stuff I heard from my experience as well, that every time he brought up this idea of not escalating the war, of getting out of Afghanistan, he was hit with this political question of, okay, you do that, and then what happens when somebody blows up a truck in Times Square? You're going to be blamed for, not being tough enough, for chickening out, for leaving Afghanistan. That emboldens here. And that's what drove, I think, so much of President Obama's decision-making on this. We know that in the first couple of days of his presidency, he had Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod telling him that using drone strikes made him look tougher, more presidential. Right. And so immediately they start using more drone strikes. Right. So much of this is the political in terms of why this happened. But this idea of scaremongering, and then we also get into the moralizing as well. If we don't leave, what's going to happen to the women, that type of thing, that dominates there. But the thing about it, when you look at it, Danny, when you look at the polling on this, it's like so many other wars in American history. The American public is supportive of the war at first. High percentages of Americans supporting in 2001, 2002, 2003. By 2004, that number still starts to drop, but a majority still support the war in Afghanistan. By 2008, it's about equal. And after 2010, by early 2010, actually, it never recovers. The war never receives majority support ever again. By 2013, 81%, I believe was the number. 81% of Americans are against the war in Afghanistan, the most unpopular war in American history, greater negative numbers than either Vietnam or the Iraq War. So even though there was this propaganda push, this moralizing and scaremongering, the American people saw through it. And actually, Matt, I want to jump in there because you're at 2013. In 2014, in July 11th, 2014 to be specific, you wrote a piece in U.S. News, which I think has a really important part that kind of tapped into that. You wrote, rewind the newsreels back over the last 13 years, and you will hear praise from American politicians over modern Afghan leaders as Jeffersonian Democrats. You will hear generals preach of counterinsurgency principles that were vanquished an enemy by winning hearts and minds and occupied population, and you will marvel
at the largesse of the billions of dollars earmarked by Congress for educational infrastructure programs for faraway people. None of these noble imaginings ever became reality. Rather, these dreams have manifested in a collective, ongoing nightmare for the American people. That's 2014. And right now, we're obviously 10 years after that. And now that it's all been manifest, just how much of a nightmare it was, and how all of it, despite all of the things you're talking about, all the political things for Obama that he was worried about, what may or may not happen, all these things about looking at the polls, all these things about worried about, oh, but what about the Afghan women and stuff? All of it's been trashed now because we would never do the right thing. And now that it ended up costing all these people, and I still have a friend who lives there to this day, and it is like draconian living there. And the quality of life for everybody is just hideous. And in large part because of what we did.
Right. I mean, we haven't even mentioned the suffering of the Afghan people on this, which has been, just unimaginable to any of us. And it's been their whole lives. I was born in 1973, which was the year the king was deposed. And so if I was an Afghan man, my whole life would have been nothing but war, foreign occupation, at best political chaos. Right. I mean, like that's the reality of life for Afghans for their entirety. And now, of course, they are suffering under this Taliban government. We spent 20 years there, as the phrase goes, to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. I mean, and so just the madness of it. I mean, I want to go back to 2014 because that's a pretty important inflection point actually for all of this. And this shows the importance of the Afghan war in terms of the American empire and how the American empire shifts in its war fighting. And so what you see Obama do, and he's rather smart about this, he's politically very astute, right? He says, I'm going to surge this war. He's able to hide sending 40,000 troops for the first half of 2009, the first 3 quarters of 2009, without anyone really ever commenting on it. And it's all about only sending 30,000 troops. But what he says is that after they're going to go for a year and a half, and at that point, we're going to start to draw down. And he's good on his words on that. And by the summer of 2011, Americans start to come home. What that does is that takes the Afghan war out of the 2012 election. It also doesn't hurt that, what's also going on to distract Americans is that 10 million Americans have been losing their homes because of the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crash, those types of things. So American attention is certainly focused inward, unlike, say, in the 06 and 08 elections, where the Iraq War was the most important issue. So Obama's able to kind of thread that needle and make it so that the Afghan war is not an issue in 2012 because he's bringing the troops home. But what they also realize, the national security state, the empire, whatever you want to call these guys, what they realize is that troops on the ground is a bad thing politically for us. That Americans coming home in body bags, don't know why they haven't figured this out before, in a faraway war that has no purpose for the American people is not a good thing politically. And so what you then see is at the same time that this has happened in 2014, go back a few years earlier because this shift has already started, is the United States is no longer going to put forces on the ground in any number where there's going to be any type of significant casualties. They're going to use special operations and CIA forces. They're going to use proxies. They're going to use contractors. They're going to use drones, things that inherently are classified, so you can't talk about them, right? We're going to hide these wars, and we're going to get other people's kids killed rather than our own to advance our interests. We've got plenty of money. If that's all it takes to get these proxies going, we've got it. And you see that happen essentially in Libya and most especially in Syria, in terms of Operation Timber Sycamore and the goal of the Obama administration to bring down the Assad government, and having that role that they had in that awful, awful civil war. So, I mean, it's important to look at how Obama played all of this out and how he was politically astute. But if anything, that should make people even more furious because it shows that the American troops who were there, and more importantly, I think the Afghan people who were there, were nothing more than pawns, nothing more than actors in a political drama meant to boost and bolster President Obama's re-election chances, and then of course the Democrats in the 2014 midterms, in a sense that they are as tough as the Republicans and they can't lose any ground on a national security front. And this really is something that's so important to them because of what we saw happen in the previous decade, how the Republicans did so well in the years after 9/11 because they were portrayed as being more trustworthy to handle national security than Democrats were. Then, of course, the Iraq War happens and the Democrats capitalize on that. And then, this is the whole idea, again, as I said earlier, of surging in Afghanistan is to show that we are better warriors, that we can protect this country better, that we're tougher.
Yeah. But, Matt, let me pick it up from there, too. So now, you just described how it transitioned throughout the Obama administration, and he's trying to be politically astute for his near-term help. But what he inadvertently did was lay the foundation for the defeat of Hillary Clinton in 2016. Right. So just 2 years later, because Trump is now running on basically an anti-war campaign, definitely an anti-Ukraine war, saying this is dumb. We shouldn't have ever been there. We shouldn't have ever stayed. And I'm going to get us out if we get in, whatever, which is kind of ironic because that's what Obama ran on against Bush to get us out of Iraq, the dumb war. And in an analysis of the 2016 election, where the casualties were for the Americans that suffered that, may have been the tipping point in a very close race otherwise that tipped it over to Trump because he was against what Hillary Clinton seemed to be for. Now then, so Trump enters in saying that he wants to get us out of the Afghan war. He's going to end up taking us out of it. That's what he claimed. And then he makes a momentous error, one of many, I'll say, in the national security area where he hires H.R. McMaster as his national security advisor. Now, just recently, McMaster was interviewed. They were asked on some of this new book that he writes where he's telling. Now, he's about to tell you here what he thought Trump was doing good in 2017. So the first year that he's actually in office. And then watch how it transitioned and what HR does about it. Watch this.
You write in the book, Trump established the first sound long-term low-cost strategy for Afghanistan and South Asia, but then abandoned that strategy and replicated the Obama policy of negotiating a withdrawal timeline with a terrorist organization, setting the stage for the Biden administration's humiliating retreat from Kabul in August 2021. You were out of the White House at the time that this was done. You write that you, quote, watched with incredulity and revulsion as he directed an envoy to negotiate withdrawal with the Taliban. You would not have advised him to do that.
Absolutely. And I advised him to do quite the opposite of that in the run up to what was his decision in August of 2017. And I tell that story in detail in the book about how really Trump made a tough decision and made, I think, what was the best available decision and put into place in 2017 the first sustainable, reasoned approach to Afghanistan. The war, by that point, had not been a 16-year war. It had been a one-year war, fought 16 times over. But, Anderson, he couldn't stick with the decision. He didn't stick with the decision. And I think people were in his ear and manipulated him into, with these mantras of, end the endless wars and Afghanistan's a graveyard of empires and so forth.
Yeah, so he's mocking Trump for not wanting to fight endless wars and a graveyard of empires, which it was until we went out. But you see that McMaster, for those who may not know, first of all, full disclosure, I fought under McMaster in Desert Storm, and we were really good friends for about 20 years until 2010 in Afghanistan, where we parted ways for some things I won't go into. But let's just say that we had a very different view on the way things should be done and the way things were done, et cetera. But one of the things that he said when he came out here and while he was in the White House was that he said we should go after the Korea model. We should never leave. We should keep troops there forever. So when Trump didn't want to keep things there forever, instead of, saying you're the president, you make the call and we'll just execute, he's saying, well, somebody must have been talking in his ear because now he doesn't want to stay forever. And so he left. And that, the other real architect of all this disaster is David Petraeus, who unfortunately I couldn't find the clip here. I'd seen it before about 3 or 4 months ago, lamented openly that he was not for the withdrawal. He does not want the so-called forever wars. We should have still stayed there and literally stayed there forever. These people cannot see any other way than military has to be the answer for everything forever. But I got to say one thing, Matt, it is so irrational to say that this one dot on the planet in Afghanistan somehow has anything to do with American national security from terrorism all over the entire globe where we have to. But they're so myopically focused on this one piece of land that they can't see anything else. And it's irrational. How do you view that?
It is. That's exactly the case. This idea that these attacks are tied to a geographic location where we know that hasn't been the case, and that the way that the ideology spreads is by the myth of that history of fighting against the Crusaders being proven true, or being at least given some validity by the presence of foreign forces in Muslim countries doing horrible things. But looking at a guy like McMaster, just the ease at which these people lie. This is all, I think, maybe he does have that ideological conviction on this, but also too, I think a lot of it is preserve their legacy. I mean, this notion that what they were doing in 2017 was different than what had been done before, and that was the first. I mean, that's just such nonsense. It's such a lie. I mean, it just in the Trump's credit, and I can't believe I use words. I've been using words like that, but to Trump's credit, he actually did give his generals, he did give his people a chance to win in Afghanistan. They came in. It wasn't just McMaster. You got to remember, Donald Trump put James Mattis in charge of the Pentagon. He had John Kelly as his chief of staff. So he gave them the opportunity to win the war because they said they could do it. And of course they couldn't do it. But they just want this thing to go on because to them, I guess their legacy is the most important thing. And, they don't ever want to have to be in a position where they have to lie like they're doing now. And that's, of course, what they're doing. They're lying about what occurred in order to make it seem as if it wasn't their fault, or that they were stabbed in the back. There was some form of betrayal. Things were going well there. And we know that's not the case. We know they've been lying about this war essentially since its inception. I mean, one of the great grand lies of the war, of course, is what happens to the former NFL player, Pat Tillman. Early on when he's killed by friendly fire, and they eulogize him and they valorize him and they cover that up and they lie about it. And, who was the person who was very much involved in that lie? Stan McChrystal, right? I mean, so like you just see the same characters run throughout the history of this war. And
let me throw one more at you there. Who's fitting this? There's obviously a constellation of stars we could go, but I want to talk just for a real brief second on General Allen, because General Allen, when he left in 2013, famously said, "Folks, this is winning. This is what winning looks like," in 2013. So 1 year after I had published my piece there, where I exposed how we were not winning, that we were losing, that everything that we were being told was a lie, he says a single year later that this is winning. We won. We should not shy from saying so. That's what he said in his change of command ceremony. Well, then I think a month later, he goes to, I think it was the Heritage Foundation, to give a speech, and he was asked, "Hey, what was one of the great things about this war that you've come out with during your tenure?" Watch this one.
I wondered if we could begin by just talking a little bit about 2 or 3 of the biggest positive developments that you saw on your watch.
Well, I think the coherence of the organization of the ANSF, from where I found it when I arrived in the summer of 2011 to where it is today, has really been dramatic.
Dramatic. So ANSF is the Afghan National Security Forces, the military for Afghanistan. So here he is bragging on the dramatic improvement of where the ANSF was. And let me remind people that when all this fiction came apart, and when it collapsed in 2021, not even 7 years hence from the time that he's making there, it was the ANSF that dissolved. And I knew from my time, that I had detailed it in my articles and in the things that I had written, that the ANSF was terrible, that they were awful, and that a lot of them were on drugs and all kinds of other reports, not just mine, but certainly I pointed that out. But now here he's telling everybody that they're great. And now that when they dissolve and they fall apart at the first chance they get, because as soon as they don't have American gunships over their back, they just quit, make deals with the Taliban, and roll out of town. Nobody ever goes back and asks these people, hey, you said this here, and you said some pretty boisterous things that we had won, and yet the minute that we withdraw, they collapse. How is that?
I know it's been that case. I remember writing in 2010 where I went back and I found statements from every commanding general in Afghanistan from 01 to 10, through Stan McChrystal, saying essentially the same thing. Just that we're winning. Progress is being made. It's just a question of more time. Light is, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. And they're never held to account. They were never held to account. How many commanders did we have in Afghanistan? And none of them were held. And most of them perjured themselves. Most of them went up there to Congress and said flatly that we are winning over and over and over again. But the Congress also as well has a very big role to place in this in terms of their abdication. In March of 2010, I got to go in and brief Ike Skelton, who at that time was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. And I briefed him and I told him what was happening in Afghanistan. And this was, a few months after Barack Obama's big speech at West Point in 2009 announcing the surge. And at this point, Operation Mashtarak, which launched off the surge, this big event in Helmand province, had been taking place, and particularly in this one town of Marja. And I went in there and I spoke to Chairman Skelton. And at the end of the briefing, my briefing to him, he said, "Thank you very much for coming in. I've never had anyone come in my office and give me a negative briefing on Afghanistan." Right. And this was 2010. We had been there for 8.5 years. And the chair of the House and Armed Services Committee is telling me that he's never heard a negative briefing about the war in Afghanistan. I mean, like that was the reality of Washington, D.C. And I can tell you a dozen other stories like that. The reality that this fiction was allowed to for no other reason I can explain other than go along and get along. Right. I had a friend who was the political advisor to NATO, so the State Department officer assigned to Brussels. And he said that when Stan McChrystal's plan for escalating the war went through Brussels, nobody agreed with it. No one thought it had a chance to work. But when it came time to initial it, and send it on to the next person, everyone initialed it, everyone sent it on, everyone gave a thumbs up to it. So it was just a culture that existed within both our political and our military and our intelligence community that just, was corrupt, with no other word, for reasons of institutional or personal legacy, ambition, what have you. And nothing changed either. So it's not like we're looking back on this and saying that, okay, that was a moment in time and then these things happened and it got better. No, absolutely not. Yeah. If anything, our the culture within our political, military, intelligence communities is worse than it was, a decade and a half ago.
Yeah, and let me just kind of highlight here that it never got better. In fact, it did continue to get worse all the way up to the end game. And I want to talk about that for a second here because, August the 29th, or August the 30th, of 2021 is when the final, soldier left and we pulled up the pitch and left. But this had started, the end had started when Trump, against all of the people who want to keep the forever wars, finally at least made a deal that said by May the 31st of 2021 is that we would have the war would come to an end and the United States would withdraw. Now that set in motion, Trump got all kinds of heat for this. And I don't want to get into the details too much of it or the pros and cons with it, but he made a deal with the Taliban in 2020 that said, you don't kill any more Americans, then we're not going to go after you, and then we'll leave by this date. And so that gave the Afghan ANSF, Ashraf Ghani, and all these people plenty of time to get their house in order that they're going to be in charge for, because all these generals for 2 decades have been telling us how the ANSF was getting better. You saw General Allen right there say, that they're remarkable and how far that they're making progress, et cetera. So they should eventually be able to stand on their own after all these time, 2 decades. That's what they're supposed to be able to do, to stand up so that they can handle it on their own. So now then we have a time period that's going to go on. But instead of the Pentagon saying, okay, yes, sir, Mr. President, you have committed the United States to this. It is an actual agreement signed by the president, signed by the Taliban, and we're going to be getting out on that day by the commander in chief. And instead, they slow rolled everything. And then they, instead of saying we're going to go to zero before Trump left office, which was his original plan, they said, we'll keep it at 2,500. We'll allow it to stay a little bit longer. And then they took no action at all to ramp things down. Any military action says, all right, here's the end date when this thing has to be executed. So then you have a series of milestones all the way through to make sure that you're progressing down so that at the end you're done. Self-evident, self-evident. That's what you're supposed to do. The Pentagon exclusively did not do any of it. So they didn't want to leave. Milley himself didn't want to leave. Now then, so we know that all the chaos that happened, the 13 Americans that were killed at Abbey Gate in Kabul during this very, very chaotic situation because of the Taliban did move in, the ANSF didn't stand, everything did fall apart, and now then we're escaping basically under the watch of the Taliban. We have to hope that they don't shoot us in Kabul while we're leaving. We made a deal, they didn't. But ISIS blew up that gate. That's what happened with that. And then who can forget these iconic pictures here of our shame when people are trying to get on the plane and some actually fell off the wheels when the thing's trying to escape, etc. So now then, after the fact, everybody's looking for somebody to blame. And in March 19th of this year, there was a testimony in Capitol Hill to where the now former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, is going on there and is asked about what happened because he was in charge during a lot of this stuff. Now, in this clip that you're about to see here, he goes on and I think tries to take the tough stance that I told them the truth. I told them what was going on here, but they didn't listen to me. Watch this.
In the fall of 2020, as I previously testified publicly, my personal analysis, was that an accelerated withdrawal would likely lead to the general collapse of the Afghan security forces and the Afghan government, resulting in a large-scale civil war reminiscent of the 1990s or a complete Taliban takeover. In November 2020, DoD received orders from the White House to reduce troop levels to 2,500 by January 15, 21. When the current administration took office in January 21, there were roughly speaking 2,500 U.S. troops on the ground with about 22,000 NATO troops and contractors. Beginning in February 21, the National Security Council conducted a 10-week interagency review of the Doha Agreement, and various options were presented and debated. In previous public testimony, I noted that at that time, my analysis, based on my assessment and the recommendations of the commanders, to include General McKenzie, and the consensus of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was that we needed to maintain a minimum force of 2,500 troops on the ground, mostly special forces, with allied troops and contractors, in order to sustain the Afghan National Security Forces and its government until the diplomatic conditions of the Doha Agreement were met. Without this support, it was my view at the time that it was only a matter of when, not if, the Afghan government would collapse and the Taliban would take control.
Okay, very important, the last thing he said there. It was my decision then, or my assessment then, that if the diplomatic conditions were not set for the Doha Agreement, which of course they would never be, it was written in such a way that you could interpret it that it would literally never be met by people like him. So he would never want to leave. But he said, no, I said that they would not be able to stand if the diplomatic conditions weren't met. That's what he said in February of 2021. Now then, let's go back and look at while he was still in uniform in July of 2021, and he had a somewhat different view. Watch this.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
The Afghan security forces have the capacity to sufficiently fight and defend their country, and we will continue to support the Afghan security forces where necessary in accordance with the guidance from the President and the Secretary of Defense. The future of Afghanistan is squarely in the hands of the Afghan people, and there are a range of possible outcomes in Afghanistan, and I want to emphasize repeatedly, and I've said this before, a negative outcome, a Taliban automatic military takeover, is not a foregone conclusion. We will continue to monitor the situation closely and make adjustments as necessary.
So there you have those just back to back. You can see the deception and the lies. So either he was lying in July of 2021, or he was lying in February 2021, or he was lying there in March of this year. Don't know which one, but they are mutually exclusive. They can't all be true. And people wonder why we don't have trust in our government when you have the senior officials flat out lying there. You see it. It's juxtaposed. It cannot be any other way. One of those times he's telling a lie. I don't know which it is, but I know that the net is we can't have any trust in our government. And this is what happens when we do that.
Right. I mean, he should be in Fort Leavenworth. He really should be. I mean, for what he did, his role in this, and then his lying to exonerate himself. I mean, this is why this will happen again, because the generals who are coming up behind him see how he was able to act, see what he was able to get away with. And now he's, working for a big investment bank, getting $75,000 a speech, wearing $4,000 suits, right? There is a compensation to the lies that is just too good for these psychopaths in uniform to, not take. I want to go back to what you were saying before about how the Pentagon slow rolled it, didn't do anything to prepare for the departure from Afghanistan, ignored the president, so forth. This idea that we are not leaving was something that the Americans were saying to their Afghan counterparts throughout 2020, through the election. The Americans in Afghanistan were convinced that when Joe Biden wins, he's going to change this, tear up the Doha Agreement. So don't worry about it. Enacted a couple of different things, but one of the things is, when the Doha Agreement is signed in February 2020, it's an agreement between the Americans and the Afghan Taliban. And then what was supposed to happen next was an agreement between the Afghan Taliban and the Ghani government, the government in Kabul. And that never takes place. And you can point fingers at both sides, but you also have to look, the Taliban came to the table right away with us. The Taliban honored their parts of the agreement, and so it really was because the Afghan government didn't think they had to negotiate, because they just thought they had to wait out Donald Trump. And then Joe Biden will come in and fix everything. When he comes in February 21 or so, when it's decided we're leaving, that's when the great panic starts to occur in Afghanistan. That's when the money stops flowing down. So what you had in Afghanistan was you had a security apparatus, a government that was basically a pyramid scheme. And it was in the sense that the money would come down and then it would be distributed to those below, everyone taking their cut. Well, if you are a part of this machine and you are afraid that the money is going to stop coming, are you going to pass any of it down? Are you only going to take your cut, or are you going to take it all? So by February 21, we start hearing, March 21, we start seeing reports about Afghan soldiers not getting paid, Afghan soldiers not getting resupplied with ammunition, Afghan soldiers not getting fed, because the money, that $300 million a day we were spending in Afghanistan, and people you heard me right, we spent $300 million a day in Afghanistan for 20 years. That money stopped flowing down to those men on the front lines, and they started packing up and walking away. So that collapse starts occurring, not because of what Milley's talking about, what Milley's lying about, but because of the very nature of the corrupt ANSF that we have built there. It was basically a business.
And let me pile on to that. So here's another thing that Milley didn't say. Here's another thing that no one on those committees asked him, but damn sure should the next time he's brought up there, which I hope comes pretty soon, and people will ask these kinds of questions. If the United States was committed to a course of action and the commander-in-chief, your boss, said this is what we're going to do, and I have committed the United States to it, then you will execute it. It's not a question. It's not an option. You don't get to decide whether you're going to or not. And if these people had not been telling the their Afghan counterparts that, don't worry about it, because when Biden comes in office, he'll undo this because it was an executive action, blah, blah, blah. Instead, if they had just been saying, all right, here's the end date, here's today's date, and then we're going to work on the milestones all the way down to execute on time to get this out. Then by the time the Biden administration comes in, then you had everything on a glide path to May 31st. And imagine then, if we had been on that track and the Afghan people knew that was going to be the case here, then almost certainly we would have completed the withdrawal on schedule, on time, in order, without leaving a bunch of stuff behind, and there would still have been an Afghan government and an Afghan national security forces. Whether they stayed or not, whether they collapsed later on is certainly up for debate, but that would have been up to them. But the withdrawal itself would have been conducted in order. But because of the failure militarily of men like General Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so it starts and stops with that guy, then none of the horrible things the way that happened, certainly 13 Americans who died almost certainly would not have, or a lot of the 200-something Afghan people who were killed in the same blast also would not have died, and you wouldn't have had all this chaos that we had. That needs to be part of this situation here, that the failure at the top, because of the lies and the unwillingness to follow orders in the chain of command by our senior leaders, contributed greatly to that chaotic scene that Gary showed a second ago.
Well, when Milley was making his statements there back in March in the Congress, and he gets to the point, he talks about how, February 2020, the Doha agreements are signed, on and on and on. February 2021, we begin the interagency process to figure out how we're going to get out. Why he wasn't stopped there by a member of Congress and said, wait, what happened? It was a year after. And this is, so that type of dereliction, that criminal negligence, I'm struggling to find the right words because this gets me so upset. And the other aspect too, you see in this is you see this, I don't want to call it, it's not naivete, it's arrogance, that we don't have to worry about what the Afghan Taliban are going to do. The Afghan Taliban had made it clear, if you don't make that May 1st, 2021 deadline, we are going to launch an offensive and we are going to win this war. And in Washington, D.C., we don't have to worry about them. They don't count. It's only what matters to us. What am I going to say on Fox News on Sunday morning? That type of thing. And they really did believe that they could just blow past that deadline. Joe Biden comes out and says, we're getting out, but I'm going to push the deadline back to September 11th, 2021, in a really crass, right? That's just a politically terrible gesture anyway. But then, this idea, and don't worry about what the Taliban are going to do. And one thing I think that our people in Washington, D.C. do not understand, they are political animals, American political animals, even our generals, and they see everything through an American political lens, and they just don't get that in other parts of the world, people mean what they say. And so when the Afghan Taliban said, if you do not get out by this date, we are going to launch our offensive. And they sure enough did. I think the speed of it surprised the Afghan Taliban themselves. I think a point I always want to make about their victory is the fact that it happened in a manner that took so many people by surprise. Because what you would think, if you were to put money on this before late spring, summer 21, you would have said the Taliban would have taken the provinces where they were strongest, where they had their traditional support in, the Pashtun provinces in the south and in the east. What we saw happen, though, is that some of the first provinces to go over to the Taliban were in the north and the west, their traditional enemies. And this was something that you and I have been arguing about, saying for literally more than a decade and a half, that what you're doing here is you're making the Taliban into an army of national liberation. You have kept in power a predatory, kleptocratic government of warlords and drug lords. And if you force these people to make a choice at the point of a rifle between either this foreign occupation with its proxy or the Afghan Taliban, they are reluctantly, they're not happy about it, but they will pick the Afghan Taliban. And that's what we saw happen in spring and summer of 2021. People throughout Afghanistan step back and they say, you know what? We'd rather have the Taliban than this Afghan government. The predation of that government is something that I don't think people really understand, how bad it was, how awful a government we have put in power and kept in power. It was a government composed of warlords and drug lords. That's it.
And Matt, I would be remiss if I didn't show this. I just feel like I have to. You talk about Ashraf Ghani, the guy who was in charge of a lot of that at the end. This is going to be a little cringeworthy to watch, because this is another one of those where we bring to a joint session of Congress and to a lot of thunderous applause to how great things are going to be for the Afghan people when he addressed Congress. Watch this.
Afghanistan will be the graveyard of Al-Qaeda and their foreign terrorist associates.
All those applause. Yeah, it's not going to be the graveyard of empires. It's going to be the graveyard of Al Qaeda and Taliban, etc. And whose grave was it? I mean, it's so predictable, but it's so painful to watch.
I actually had been asked to write an op-ed for Politico when he made that speech, and I spoke in the op-ed of how corrupt he was, and Politico refused to run the op-ed.
Oh,
I mean,
man.
so it wasn't just the members of Congress. It was our whole political establishment, our whole media establishment that was going along with this narrative. And yeah, I mean, and it comes undone. The house of cards falls apart in 2021, for many reasons, but a lot of it because of our own hubris, our own arrogance, our own failure to understand what the world actually looks like. Our narrative became reality for us, and you still see that. McMaster, Allen, Milley, these guys, what they say, I don't think they're lying maybe as much as they actually believe that this was the reality, that they were so seduced, that they were these crackpot realists, they were these fantasists and fabulous, that they believed it. There's a book I found in the Marine Corps, a book that officers were supposed to read was T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War, about the Korean War. And it opens with a passage. It opens with a passage about how the Marine Corps are the modern day legionaries of the world, and like it has this passage in Rome, he was called legionary. In today, he is called Marine, something like that, right? Real raw kind of stuff. Anyway, but you see it when you look at the Trump administration, who he brings into power, McMaster, Mattis, Kelly. These guys really did see themselves as modern day legionaries. They really did see themselves as officers of the empire. And so this idea to them to lose any part of it is anathema. They really do view the world not even in as a Zbigniew Brzezinski grand chessboard kind of way, because there's strategy and all that. They really just view it in a Borderlands type of way, in the sense that we have to protect ourselves from the barbarians, and that means holding territory with walls to keep them back. And I think you look at McMaster, you look at Mattis, you look at Kelly, you look at all these other types all throughout Washington, D.C. that really believed in the cause of this war, and you get back to, I think, that understanding of who they saw themselves as, and that's why they're so easy for them to lie. Like Milley does, like McMaster does, like Petraeus does. And the criminal thing about it is that the media allows it to continue. At any point with that interview with McMaster, did Anderson Cooper stop him and say, "What the hell are you talking about? Where was the progress?" The Washington Post in 2019 published this huge expose of the lies of this war, how like it was just one big deliberate scam run by the American government's military to misinform and lie to the American people. The dance. I mean, so it's on so many levels here, and then again, no accountability for it whatsoever.
Well, yeah, not only no accountability. I mean, that whole interview was HR with his new book that he's selling days ago. So I'm sure that on this day and probably around it, and maybe even this weekend, there'll be other shows where he's on there, hawking books and making money off of this stuff.
Yeah, and it becomes the conventional wisdom, the narrative that victory was at hand, that Joe Biden betrayed us. I mean, it's the same thing that occurs in every war.
I know.
You're seeing it now with Ukraine. If you look at like publications like Politico, you will see these arguments being put forward that Joe Biden is betraying the Ukrainians. Joe Biden's legacy is going to be one of betrayal to the Ukrainians if he does not provide them JASSM missiles, or he doesn't allow us to fire ATACMS into Russian cities or something
or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, like, it's the same messaging. It's utilized over and over again because it's effective. It's effective. I mean, you have people still in this country who believe that the Vietnam War was winnable. If only the media hadn't stabbed us in the back, if only the Democrats hadn't stabbed us in the back, on and on and on. I mean, like it's something that I'm grateful that there's folks like you and Gary, who's behind the scenes, who's doing this kind of work, because we need it, because we need to have this ability to accurately talk about what has happened, what is happening now, and what's most likely going to happen, right? Because the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, right? And so if you bring a guy like McMaster, you bring a guy like Allen, you bring a guy like Kelly into your administration, what do you think it's going to look like? It's going to look like lies, gaslighting, and a whole lot of people getting killed and suffering occurring for nothing more than institutional and personal gain.
And that's wraps up and sums it up really nicely. And that's what we have right now. And there's no evidence that anything, I mean, just look at Jack Keane, who's on all the time. David Petraeus is on all the time. David Petraeus, nobody was more wrong on Afghanistan than he was. Nobody was more wrong on the Russia-Ukraine war on as much as he was. You may recall, we've shown this clip several times on the show of before the 2023 summer offensive by the Ukraine side. He predicted that the Russian defenses would crumble, crack, and just fall apart, and that Ukraine would go all the way to the Azov coast. And he listed all these reasons why, which were all complete nonsense. None of it happened, and nobody put a mark in his face since that time and said, yeah, like you said back in May, how did that work out? And instead, they handed him a mic and say, what do you think is going to happen next?
Yeah,
and keep going on.
Two stories I want to tell, because it's just not these personalities, it's what surrounds them, and it's the actual system that reinforces his behavior that makes these types of wars inevitable, essentially, right? When I was leaving Afghanistan and people were having a fit about my resignation letter, and there were people who were, I mean, the stories I can tell about that, I told you about what Eikenberry said to me, but we had a deputy ambassador in Kabul. That's kind of an odd thing. But anyway, this guy, career Foreign Service guy, Ricky Ardeli, he became the ambassador to Turkey or something like that later on. He said to me, this is just one of many statements like that. He says, I agree with you. I got two kids who are, we're in Kabul. I got two kids who are military age, and there's no way I would let them serve here in Afghanistan. Right? I mean, this is the deputy ambassador of the American embassy saying this in 2009 in Afghanistan. The other thing is I come home and I've got to go see Chuck Hagel, who, former senator, future secretary of defense. He's at Georgetown University. He's also, along with David Boren, who was also a senator, now the head of Oklahoma University, the co-chairs of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. Both Hagel and Boren, I think, have been chairs of the Senate Intelligence Committees at some point. And so anyway, I've got to go and see these guys and testify to the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, essentially because Boren and Hagel want to know why what I'm hearing from you, Matt Ho, is the same that we hear at Georgetown and University of Oklahoma and other places from all these military officers who come through about the war in Afghanistan. You match up with what these captains and majors and colonels in our schools are telling us. And none of that matches up with what's going to the president's desk. Right? I mean, so you had this realization, this knowledge within the government, of course, that, look, what's going to the president's desk is BS. It's all meant to further the narrative, all meant to assure that the only thing the president can consider is to go along with the victory narrative. And of course, what comes from that, Hagel becomes Obama's Secretary of Defense. I mean, but you see it as well too. Go back to, was it 2015, where you have our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, the head of Central Command at that time, 50 members of 50 intelligence officers down at Central Command revolt, and they go to the IG and they say, General Austin is changing our intelligence. What General Austin is forwarding back on to Washington, D.C. is not the intelligence we are giving him about Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. And what happens to General Austin? Nothing. He becomes a board on the board of directors of Raytheon, and now he's a Secretary of Defense. Even though you had 50 intelligence officers on his staff who went to the IG and say General Austin is changing the intelligence before he sends it up to Washington, D.C. Right? I mean, that's just the system we have. And so, the point I was going to make was that when I went, General McChrystal was out of Kabul when I was resigning, and I wasn't going to stay and wait for him to come back. And I had to go over and talk to his staff, and his staff was just full of sycophants. These lieutenant colonels and Navy commanders, and they've got their tridents on, and they got their tabs and all that stuff, right? and they're just absolute sycophants. And so we talk about this, we go over it, spend a whole day over there with these guys, and they're arguing. I'd say this, they say that. Yeah, but almost always their argument came back to, well, if General McChrystal thought it was the right thing, then it would be the right thing. That was it. He surrounded himself just with men and some women who had no other interest other than to tell him he was right. And how many, I mean, that was 2009. So we only had about, after Obama's escalation, I think at the time of Obama coming to office, there's 500 dead American kids over there. When he leaves, there's 2,500 and countless Afghans.
Yeah. And wounded Americans and PTSD
Yeah.
Americans
Oh,
and
yeah.
TBI Americans and all this kind of stuff.
Right,
But
exactly. Yeah.
that's the cost of it. And, I wish we had some power to change something. I think overall in time, maybe things like this, where we're putting the truth out there and you can corroborate what we're saying with what actually happens. And you see over time, you see, especially things that both Matt and I had written, going back a decade and a half, a very consistent message that completely lines up with what actually happens, as opposed to these guys who are making millions of dollars on book sales and getting to be secretaries of defense, et cetera. As long as that keeps happening, we're going to, you said it, you're perfect yourself. This will keep happening because we've got a system that's going to ensure that it does.
Right.
But hey, listen, all we can do is what we can do, and we're going to keep doing it. We're going to keep telling the truth. We're going to keep putting these things out there. And if nothing else, we're going to hold people's feet to the fire. And especially if these things finally come back and really do bite us in the ass hard one day, and people finally want to know what was going on, there's a record out here of what was going on. And God willing, that at that time, maybe we can start making some difference. But all it's necessary is to have a foundation for this, and that's what we're going to keep doing. Thanks for coming on today, Matt. Thanks for this crystal clear truth about what's really going on and what's at stake and how this stuff keeps working. Knowledge is power, and we've now given some more knowledge and some more power to our audience. So we appreciate you guys. Ask you to do something with this. Tag this to somebody else, share it with whoever you want, but let's get this word out there so that this can't stay in the shadows any longer. Thank you very much for all of you, and thanks for watching today. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.